Michigan, 2008. A cold case, finally solved. Natalie Ann Marquette, a 30-year-old bakery owner, was a beloved figure in her lakeside town, known for her warm laugh and morning pastries. Natalie vanished one September evening without a trace. Her car was found abandoned on a quiet rural road, keys still in the ignition, a single trail of footprints leading into the woods. Despite exhaustive searches, mounting community pressure, and even whispers of misconduct within the department, the case went cold. For years, there were no answers, only heartbreak. But now, over a decade later, a stunning DNA breakthrough and a shocking arrest have brought the truth to light. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In the heart of a small Michigan town bordered by Lake Huron's calm blue waters, there was a bakery where the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread drifted through the streets before the sun had fully risen. The bakery was called Sweet June's, and it was run by a woman whose presence warmed the town just as much as her pastries did. Natalie Ann Marquette was 30 years old, with soft eyes that crinkled when she smiled, and a laugh that customers often said lingered like sunshine. The bakery, named after her late mother, was her pride and legacy. Each morning, the bell above the door chimed with regulars, teachers, truck drivers, high schoolers, and retirees, greeted by the familiar sight of Natalie in her flour-dusted apron, her hair pulled back, a mug of black coffee in hand. Natalie wasn't just a business owner, she was a fixture of the community. She knew birthdays, allergies, and how to spot when someone needed a free muffin and a quiet conversation more than anything else. Her impact rippled out quietly, delivering cookies to nursing homes, sponsoring bake sales, slipping bread to the unemployed without charge. She lived in a modest two-bedroom house with her elderly father, Harold, a retired electrician whose health had declined in recent years. Her younger brother, Evan, lived nearby and often helped with deliveries and repairs around the bakery. After their mother's death from cancer, Natalie had become the emotional glue in the family, balancing grief with resilience, mourning with motion. To the outside world, she appeared fulfilled. She'd never married, but not from lack of interest. She'd once dated a man from Alpena, but it hadn't lasted. Rumors said she preferred the simplicity of small-town life over the entanglements of complicated relationships. She often joked, "My heart's already full," with coffee, dough, and the people who walked through that door. Locals recalled Natalie as someone who lit up early mornings. Her hands always moved, kneading, frosting, folding, but her attention was sharp. If someone cried in her shop, she offered space. If someone laughed, she amplified it. She had become, in many ways, the beating heart of the town. There were no signs of trouble, no rumors, no fear in her eyes. Her schedule was a rhythm everyone came to count on. The lights at Sweet June's flicked on at 4:30 a.m., the last tray pulled from the oven by 9, and the doors closed around 3 p.m. After that, she'd visit her father, walk along the lake, or attend local fundraisers. It was a peaceful loop. But it's often in the stillness that the first crack appears, silent, unnoticed. One friend would later remember a strange moment weeks before Natalie disappeared. Natalie paused mid-laugh at a birthday party, glancing over her shoulder as if she felt watched. But she quickly brushed it off, claiming she was just tired. No one imagined anything sinister. In towns like this, where people leave their doors unlocked and their hearts open, it's easy to forget that danger doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it waits in the quiet, slipping between the seconds of daily life. That September, Natalie baked her last batch of cinnamon rolls, wiped down the counter, and turned the sign to closed. No one knew it would be the last time they'd see her. What could possibly tear someone like Natalie from a life so full of purpose and love? Thursday, September 11th, 2008, began like any other day in the town of Marquette. The morning air was cool and crisp with a hint of fall threading through the late summer breeze. Natalie Marquette arrived at Sweet June's early as usual. By 6 a.m., the ovens were on and the first batch of cinnamon rolls was rising. Customers trickled in, offering their usual greetings, smiles, and stories. But something was different. Natalie seemed preoccupied. Not distraught, just quiet, A few noticed it. She smiled, but it didn't linger. She moved through her tasks like someone watching the clock. Around 1:30 p.m., she told a regular customer, a retired teacher named Mrs. Crowley, that she had to run an errand and would be closing up early. She didn't offer more. Natalie locked up the shop by 2 p.m., earlier than usual. That was the last time anyone reported seeing her. By evening, Natalie's phone went unanswered. Her brother Evan sent her a text. No reply. Her father called around 6 p.m. Nothing. It wasn't like her to disappear even for a few hours. By 9 p.m., Evan was driving through town checking her usual haunts. The grocery store, the lakefront, a friend's house. No sign of her. At 6:45 the next morning, a county deputy responding to a passerby's report found Natalie's white Honda Civic pulled off a desolate stretch of gravel road about 10 miles out town. The road, known to locals as Clearview Trail, wound through dense forest and wasn't a typical route for anyone heading anywhere. The car's engine was cold. The driver's door was ajar. Natalie's purse sat on the passenger seat. Her wallet still inside, untouched. Her phone was gone. So were her keys. And then there were the footprints. A single pair of prints led from the driver's side of the car into the woods.
Literally vanished. Within hours, law enforcement cordoned off the area. Drones and helicopters scanned the forest canopy. Canine units scoured the underbrush. Volunteers combed the woods shoulder to shoulder. Flashlights cut through the dusk. The town came together with a determination fueled by disbelief. But as night fell again, they had nothing. No clothing, no broken branches, no cries for help. Just silence and the lingering echo of Natalie's absence. The town turned frantic. Flyers with Natalie's photo appeared on shop windows, telephone poles, and church bulletin boards. The image, a candid shot of her behind the bakery counter, smiling and flower-streaked, became burned into the community's collective consciousness. Local businesses offered rewards. The town organized vigils. Nose crews began arriving. For the first time in years, national attention focused on Marquette, but not for reasons anyone wanted. And then came the rumors. Some whispered she'd run away, that maybe she'd grown tired of the small-town life. Others speculated about secret relationships, debts, or threats. A few claimed to have seen a man in a dark hoodie watching the bakery days before. But there were no facts, just fragments and fear. Police assured the public they were following all leads. But days passed, then weeks, and the search began to feel more like a ritual than a rescue. The bakery remained closed, the windows dark. A vase of wilting sunflowers sat by the door. Sweet June's, once the heart of the community, was now a haunting reminder of what had been lost. Natalie Marquette, the woman who had touched so many lives, had simply disappeared. What did investigators uncover in those early frantic days? And why did it all lead nowhere? 14 days after Natalie Marquette vanished, the town of Marquette was holding its breath, clinging to fading hope. Search teams had scaled back, leads had slowed, and then a grim breakthrough came from someone who wasn't even looking for her. On the morning of September 25th, a bow hunter trekking through a remote stretch of the Huron National Forest noticed an odd mound beneath a layer of dead leaves and moss. Curious, he stepped closer, nudging at it with his boot. What he uncovered would shatter the town. Beneath the shallow covering was a woman's body, bruised, bound, and lifeless. Authorities were called immediately. Within hours, a perimeter was established. Crime scene tape draped through the trees, and investigators swarmed the secluded area. The site was located over 30 meters from where Natalie's car had been discovered, deep enough into the woods to require off-road vehicles and GPS coordination to access. The victim was soon identified: Natalie Ann Marquette. The details were devastating. Her wrists were tied behind her back with coarse rope. Her throat showed signs of manual strangulation. Her clothing was disheveled, though the coroner later stated there was no clear indication of sexual assault. The autopsy revealed defensive wounds on her arms and hands, bruises and lacerations, suggesting she fought back. She had been dead for nearly the entire time she'd been missing. The community's anguish, which had hovered in the air for weeks, now cracked open. Candlelight vigils, once filled with hope, transformed into tear-streaked memorials. The bakery door, once propped open by a basket of fresh scones, remained shut, now covered in photos, flowers, and handwritten messages. Natalie's father collapsed upon hearing the news, overcome with grief and the cruel finality of it all. Her brother Evan retreated from public view entirely. Friends said he barely spoke for days. Despite the emotional devastation, the discovery ignited a new surge of investigative effort. Forensic teams spent days combing the burial site. Soil samples were taken, fibers and hairs were collected. Trace evidence from the ropes was preserved. Swabs were taken from under Natalie's fingernails. If there had been a struggle, they hoped she might have left behind her attacker's DNA. Yet strangely, there were no signs of a struggle near the burial site itself. No dragged footprints, no broken branches. It was as if Natalie had been transported there after death and placed with care, not hastily dumped, but arranged. A shallow grave, hidden but not deeply concealed. This detail haunted the lead investigators. The calculated nature of it suggested premeditation or at least experience. Whoever did this didn't panic. They took their time. Natalie's toxicology report came back clean. No alcohol, no sedatives. This wasn't a case of impaired judgment or an accidental encounter gone wrong. This was controlled, deliberate violence. The killer had the strength and the will to silence her, and the knowledge to leave behind almost nothing. But the police weren't empty-handed. They had physical evidence now. The rope, the soil, the fibers, the samples under her nails. They had a time of death. They had a body. The question was, would it be enough? In an age where DNA was solving decades-old cases across the country, Marquette's residents believed justice was within reach. But as days turned to weeks with no arrests, that hope began to dim again. Natalie's photo remained on bulletin boards and candlelight shrines. Her name was spoken in past tense. And for the first time, the town began to fear something worse than disappearance: impunity. The question shifted from where to who. And most haunting of all, why hadn't the killer been caught? With physical evidence in hand, why couldn't the police close in on a suspect? From the moment Natalie's body was recovered, detectives poured into the case with urgency. Local homicide units, aided by state investigators, set up a command post in a municipal building and began methodical interviews. They spoke to everyone close to Natalie: ex-boyfriends, friends, suppliers, employees, and the occasional stranger who remembered a face in the bakery.
Dozens of interviews were conducted. Some individuals were asked to submit to polygraph exams. Warrants were sought and executed for residences, vehicles, and electronic records. Evidence logs grew long. Paperwork proliferated. The sense of momentum was real, but so were the obstacles. One early person of interest was a delivery driver who'd been seen arguing with Natalie over a late shipment of baking supplies. He was detained for questioning, his statement scrutinized for inconsistency. When investigators verified timestamps, receipts, and multiple independent witnesses, his alibi held. Another lead emerged from a woman who claimed Natalie had been followed home by an unknown man and had confided in her about feeling uneasy. Investigators canvassed neighborhoods, searched surveillance footage, and re-interviewed friends. the sighting could not be substantiated. At the burial site, forensic teams documented a partial boot print impressed in soft soil near the shallow grave. Specialists photographed and cast the print, but the pattern was incomplete, worn by weather and time. Local shoe manufacturers and retailers were consulted. The print returned no matches in national databases. Aside from that, physical evidence remained frustratingly sparse. Hair fibers, trace cloth fibers, and a few degraded cellular samples that initially resisted profiling. As inquiries broadened, tensions surfaced. Detectives from competing jurisdictions clashed over control of the investigation. Paper trails were misfiled, chain of custody logs showed gaps, items labeled for analysis were misplaced in storage. In small towns where resources are limited and relationships intertwined, procedural missteps can have oversized consequences. Rumors, some grounded, some speculative, swirled through the community. Whispers about mishandled evidence and bureaucratic bickering fed fervent online discussion and fueled distrust. Community trust, once robust, began to erode. Town meetings grew heated. Questions aimed at police leadership multiplied. Was the evidence properly logged? Were all leads being pursued? Critics pointed to delays in forensic testing and the lack of clear updates. Family members demanded transparency. Natalie's father retreated from public life, slamming doors on reporters. Her brother Evan, wounded by grief and disillusionment, left town to stay with a friend out of state. Investigative momentum slowed. Leads that might have been fresh deteriorated with time. Witness memories blurred. Possible suspects moved away or died. Forensic samples languished in lab queues, delayed by backlogs and limited funding. What began as a highly visible hunt tapered into a slower, paperwork-driven slog through files, subpoenas, and follow-ups that yielded little. The case shifted from frantic fieldwork to an archivist task, sorting, recataloguing, hoping a missed note might become relevant. Yet even amid apparent negligence or ordinary human error, some asked a harsher question. Had someone deliberately impeded the probe? Had relationships and small-town loyalties created blind spots that protected a suspect? In communities where former acquaintances become jurors, employers, or in-law relations, conflicts of interest are an ever-present threat. Internal reviews were promised, meetings were held, a few officers were reassigned, but public reassurances rarely erased the sting of delay. Detectives grew weary. Small victories were suffocated by administrative delays. A dedicated cold case advocate from a neighboring county volunteered to review files, finding inconsistencies that begged for re-examination. Grassroots investigators, neighbors, retired officers, and true crime bloggers kept the story alive online, pushing for renewed testing and public accountability. Yet for every new voice, the official record remained stubbornly unmoving. The investigation, for all its early energy, staggered in the months that followed. The town's grief hardened into skepticism. Vigil candles burned alongside accusations. Friends who had once expected swift justice now kept their distance, fearful of being drawn into an expensive, exhausting fight for answers. What caused the case to slip through the cracks? And was someone truly, intentionally burying the truth? By the summer of 2010, just 2 years after Natalie Marquette's murder shocked the quiet community of Marquette, Michigan, the once urgent investigation had drifted into a numbing stillness. The yellowed flyers, once plastered to storefronts and telephone poles, had peeled away. Her smiling face, once a rallying symbol for justice, became an uncomfortable memory. People stopped asking questions. The momentum was gone. The bakery, Sweet June's, sat vacant for months before being sold to a new owner who remodeled it and changed the name. The comforting smell of cinnamon rolls no longer drifted down the street each morning. That chapter had closed. Natalie's absence became something people lived with, like a permanent shadow cast across the town square. The police department quietly transferred the Marquette file to the cold case unit, a section that existed more for optics than action. With limited funding and a small team, the case slipped into an abyss of manila folders, unprocessed evidence kits, and fading interest. Officers who had once pounded pavement for leads were reassigned, promoted, or retired. The energy was gone. The urgency faded into procedural limbo. Natalie's father, Harold, never recovered from the loss of his only daughter. His health declined steadily. In 2013, he passed away after a short illness. At the funeral, Evan Marquette stood beside his father's casket and delivered a brief, heartbreaking eulogy. "They took her," he said to a silent congregation, "and they got away with it." The words lingered in the air, unresolved and bitter. Afterward, Evan packed what remained of his family's life and left Marquette. Some said he moved out west, others claimed he wanted to forget. But forgetting was never really an option, not when justice had never been served. Natalie's case became a ghost story of sorts. It lived on in Reddit threads, true crime podcasts, and midnight radio shows. Her story was passed from one curious listener to another, often bundled with conspiracy theories and amateur sleuth speculation. Yet, in Marquette, people stopped speaking her name aloud, not out of disrespect, but out of helplessness. It hurt too much to remember how much she'd meant and how little had come from her loss. The burial site in Huron National Forest grew wild again. The forest, indifferent to human tragedy, reclaimed the soil where Natalie's body had been found. The path that had once been cordoned off by police tape was now overgrown, indistinguishable from the rest of the dense Michigan woods. For nearly a decade, the case gathered dust. The few lingering suspects identified in the early investigation had faded from attention. One had moved out of state, another had passed away. Background checks were no longer run, tips no longer chased, evidence no longer reanalyzed. The boot print, the rope, the fingernail samples, they sat in storage untouched. And yet the truth has a strange persistence. Even in silence, it waits. Evidence does not vanish simply because it's forgotten. It waits for science to catch up, for curiosity to return, for someone new to care. In 2018, the Michigan State Police applied for a federal grant to process cold case DNA evidence using updated forensic technology. Natalie's file was listed almost as an afterthought, among dozens of others. A lab tech flagged it, but the process was slow. Bureaucracy moved at a crawl. Still, her name had surfaced again, not in headlines, but in lab logs. A sample taken from under Natalie's fingernails, once deemed too degraded to analyze, was now marked for re-examination. It sat in a small labeled vial in a temperature-controlled lab, quietly waiting. What piece of evidence was quietly waiting to speak again years later? In early 2021, change arrived not through a detective's intuition or a tip phoned in from a concerned citizen, but through science. After years of stagnation, Michigan's Cold Case Task Force was granted a new lifeline: federal funding, specifically earmarked for reprocessing DNA in unsolved violent crimes. Among the boxes pulled from deep storage and handed over to review was one with a faded label: Marquette Natalie A. 2008. Inside the evidence kit, a technician at a state crime lab found the degraded DNA swab once collected from beneath Natalie's fingernails. In 2008, the sample had been deemed too contaminated for analysis. Back then, the technology wasn't advanced enough to draw clear conclusions from such trace-damaged material. But 13 years later, everything had changed. Using advanced genomic reconstruction and whole genome sequencing, the technician managed to extract a partial DNA profile. It wasn't a full profile, not enough to search CODIS or match against known offenders, but it was enough for something else: investigative genetic genealogy. That sample was submitted to a national database used to help identify familial connections, often accessed through open-source platforms. It was a long shot, but within months, the system returned a hit: a second cousin to a man living in northern Michigan, just 2 counties away from Marquette. This was no ordinary lead. Genealogists and investigators worked side by side, building out a sprawling family tree using public records, obituaries, census data, and online ancestry submissions. They traced the lineage backward and forward, filling in branches, cross-referencing names, examining age ranges, locations, and family ties. The process was painstaking and precise. Finally, one name emerged, standing at the end of a branch no one had ever looked at before: Stanley D. Pierce, a 52-year-old mechanic living in Alpena County. No criminal record, no prior connection to Natalie on file, no mention in the original investigation, no known motive, no interviews, nothing.
but he was genetically linked. Detectives were stunned. After years of suspecting someone in Natalie's orbit, an ex, a friend, a disgruntled customer, here was a complete outsider. Someone who had seemingly moved through life unnoticed by the case, living less than 100 miles from where her body was found. Investigators launched a quiet background investigation into Pierce's life. They discovered he had been working in Marquette during the fall of 2008, doing contract vehicle repairs. His business had serviced a number of cars in the area, including Natalie's Honda Civic, according to a now obscure receipt from a local garage that had since changed owners. That single document connected them. More chilling details emerged. Pierce had been scheduled to perform brake work on Natalie's car just weeks before her disappearance. He had access to her vehicle and potentially her routine, but one piece was still missing: confirmation. Detectives launched surveillance, gathering discarded items, coffee cups, napkins, cigarette butts for covert DNA comparison. Lab technicians cross-referenced the DNA from Natalie's fingernail swab against the sample from Pierce. The results came back, a conclusive match. The partial profile, once considered too degraded to now have a name, Stanley Pierce. But detectives remained cautious. They had the science, but could they prove means, motive, and opportunity? Would a jury believe that this man, with no prior offenses, had harbored a darkness hidden from the world? A knock on a door was coming, but they had to be sure.
Would this DNA match finally lead them to the killer? Or just another ghost in the system? It was just after sunrise on March 14, 2023, when unmarked vehicles pulled into a quiet residential cul-de-sac in Alpena County, Michigan. The neighborhood, still wrapped in morning stillness, didn't yet know that a moment of reckoning had arrived. At 6:42 a.m., uniformed officers and detectives approached a modest ranch-style home with weathered siding and a worn Ford pickup in the driveway. Inside, 52-year-old Stanley D. Pierce stood at the kitchen counter brewing coffee. He didn't run. He didn't protest. When officers entered the home with a warrant for his arrest, he simply looked up and said, "I figured this was coming." Pierce had no prior arrests, no domestic abuse complaints, no visible signs of a violent past. He ran a small but consistent auto repair business from a garage behind his home. To his neighbors, he was quiet, courteous, kept to himself. But beneath that surface lay secrets that had been buried for nearly 15 years. When investigators confronted him with the DNA evidence collected from under Natalie Marquette's fingernails and matched through forensic genealogy, Pierce didn't outright deny knowing her. In fact, he offered a version of events that was both strange and chilling. "We were friendly," he told detectives. "She'd come in for work on her car, talked a lot, kind of had a temper, if I'm being honest, but..." Records told a different story. Text logs revealed no evidence of any ongoing communication between Pierce and Natalie. In fact, Pierce's number didn't appear in her phone at all. Surveillance footage from 2008 was no longer available, but paperwork from a now-defunct repair shop confirmed that Natalie's vehicle had been serviced by Pierce only once, just weeks before her disappearance. Inside Pierce's garage, a search turned up more disturbing clues. Hidden in a box beneath a rusted workbench, officers recovered a set of rope fragments and a stained pair of gloves. The fibers matched those used to bind Natalie's wrists. Soil samples taken from Pierce's tools matched mineral content from the remote burial site in the Huron National Forest. These weren't circumstantial coincidences. They were pieces of a long-buried truth finally snapping into place. The arrest sent a shockwave through Marquette. News spread quickly. Pierce wasn't a total stranger. His business had quietly served residents in and around the area for years. Some residents even recalled seeing his name on receipts for oil changes or brake repairs. He'd blended into the fabric of everyday life. A ghost hiding in plain sight. That made the betrayal all the more chilling. By noon, reporters had descended on both Alpena and Marquette. Headlines blared across regional networks. Arrest made in 2008 bakery owner murder. Photos of Natalie resurfaced. Her apron, her smile, her shop. Vigils were held that evening. Dozens gathered at her grave, many bringing flowers, others simply standing in silence, letting the moment settle. For the first time in 15 years, there was movement. Real movement. Pierce was formally charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. The prosecution would allege premeditation,
asserting that Pierce had targeted Natalie after servicing her car and used his knowledge of her routine to ambush her. The charges came with no bail, and Pierce was transferred to the state correctional facility to await trial. But justice, as always, is never swift. Evan Marquette returned to town for the first time in nearly a decade. He stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, looking out at the sea of reporters, and said only 5 words: "We've waited long enough." The arrest gave the town a sense of release, but also unearthed painful memories that had been locked away. The trial loomed. Witnesses would have to testify. Questions would be asked. Would the courtroom finally deliver what the family had been denied for 15 years? On November 4th, 2024, nearly 16 years after the murder of Natalie Ann Marquette, the trial of Stanley D. Pierce began in the Marquette County Courthouse. The old brick building stood quiet that morning, but inside it was filled with generations of townspeople, many of whom hadn't spoken her name aloud in years. Reporters filled the front benches. A sketch artist flipped pages as lawyers reviewed thick binders of evidence. Evan Marquette sat in the front row, flanked by his wife and 2 close friends. He hadn't returned to this courtroom since his father's probate hearing in 2013. Now he was back to face the man who had stolen everything from his family. The prosecution opened with a blunt statement. This is not a story about a missing person. This is the story of a woman who was hunted, taken, and silenced. But her voice, through science, has finally been heard. Their case was strong. Forensic experts took the stand, detailing the DNA recovered from under Natalie's fingernails and the genetic genealogy process that led to Pierce. Jurors were shown images of the rope used to bind her. The fibers matched to samples found in Pierce's garage, and mineral analysis linking tools in his possession to the soil where Natalie had been buried. But the defense fought back. Pierce's attorney argued that he and Natalie had a brief relationship and that any physical evidence could be explained by consensual contact. He claimed that Natalie was under stress and may have been meeting someone else that night, but there were no records, no texts, no calls, no notes linking her to anyone but Pierce. The most emotional moments came during the testimony of Natalie's friends, who painted a stark picture of her final weeks. One recalled Natalie mentioning a man who made her uncomfortable, someone who stared too long when she brought her car in. Another testified that Natalie seemed unusually anxious in early September, double-checking locks, leaving work early, declining social invitations. Then came Evan, called to the stand on the 4th day of the trial. His voice trembled as he described Natalie's last text message. "I'll stop by after this. Shouldn't be long." The visit never happened. That text, he said, became a timestamp he'd never forget. "That night rewrote our lives," he told the court. "I kept thinking, what if I'd called her 5 minutes earlier?" The defense cross-examined him gently, but his grief was unshakable. His pain filled the room. Some jurors wiped tears from their eyes.
Closing arguments painted 2 opposing pictures. The defense presented Pierce as a misunderstood man, wrongly accused, while the prosecution reminded jurors that Natalie couldn't tell her side because Pierce had silenced her. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On the afternoon of the 8th day, the verdict was read aloud. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, kidnapping, evidence tampering. Pierce showed no visible reaction. He stood motionless, eyes fixed ahead as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Applause broke out, not of celebration but of exhausted relief. But as the crowd dispersed, another discussion began to simmer. How had this case gone unsolved for so long? Why had it taken 15 years, evolving forensic science, and a federal grant to uncover what should have been found sooner? The trial became more than a verdict. It became a referendum on the system that failed Natalie for so long, on the backlog of untested rape kits, the underfunding of cold case units, and the weight of bureaucratic inertia. Natalie's family had found justice, but others still waited. Now that justice was served, what would Natalie's story change for others like her? Today, if you walk down Sycamore Street in Marquette, Michigan, you'll see something new and yet deeply familiar. On the brick wall that once framed the entrance to Sweet June's Bakery, a large mural stretches across the side of the building. It depicts Natalie Ann Marquette as she was remembered, apron on, hands in motion, sunlight in her smile. Around her, painted ribbons swirled with phrases like "never forgotten," "justice found," and "persistence changes everything." The building is no longer a bakery. It's been reborn as Natalie's House, a cooperative cafe and resource center that provides support and transitional services to domestic violence survivors and women re-entering the workforce. Inside, the scent of coffee still lingers, but now it's accompanied by quiet conversations, counseling sessions, job coaching, and safety planning. Natalie's brother, Evan Marquette, helped bring this vision to life. After the trial ended and Pierce was sentenced, Evan poured his energy into creating something lasting not only for his sister, but for countless others still trapped in silence and fear. He co-founded the Marquette Foundation for Cold Case Justice, which provides grants to assist underfunded law enforcement agencies with DNA testing, genealogical research, and evidence preservation. The foundation also supports legislation for national cold case funding and transparency mandates. "I wanted to make sure no family has to wait 15 years for answers like we did," Evan told a reporter at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Natalie was more than a headline. She was a daughter, a sister, a soul that changed people just by showing up. Now, she's still showing up, just in a different way. Natalie's story has reached far beyond her small lakeside town. In criminal justice classrooms across Michigan, her case is now taught as part of a curriculum on cold case methodology, forensic genealogy, and systemic failures in early investigations. Students learn not just about evidence, but about empathy, the human cost of procedural delays, and the resilience of those who refuse to let a case go cold in their hearts. Professors invite Evan to speak at lectures and law enforcement panels. He brings Natalie's story to life, not through spectacle, but through memory. He tells them about her laugh, her morning rituals, her cinnamon rolls. He tells them about the quiet courage she carried and the world that changed the day she didn't come home. For Marquette, the healing continues slowly. Natalie's mural has become a pilgrimage site. People leave flowers, handwritten notes, even framed photos of loved ones still missing. Survivors stop by to sit in the sunlight beneath her painted gaze, some staying for hours in silent reflection. Local artists host workshops there, and true crime podcasters sometimes record special episodes from the cafe, with proceeds going toward the foundation. Natalie's legacy has become more than memory. It's become a movement. And yet, with each step forward, there's a whisper that lingers. How many Natalies are still waiting? How many stories are still buried in file cabinets and untested evidence kits? How many families ache with questions that science has not yet answered and courts have yet to hear? Natalie's voice, once silenced, now echoes across communities. Her case reminds us that the passage of time cannot erase truth, that even in cold cases, warmth remains in the people who refuse to forget, in the systems we fight to fix, and in the legacies we choose to build. Her light continues to guide others home. In remembering Natalie, how many other voices will finally be heard? Natalie Ann Marquette's story is one of warmth, extinguished far too early, but not without purpose. Her 2008 murder stunned the quiet Michigan town she called home, leaving a shuttered bakery, a grieving family, and a lingering void in the heart of a community that once woke up to her smile and cinnamon rolls. For years, the case remained frozen in uncertainty, with evidence buried under bureaucracy and a killer hidden behind a facade of normalcy. But time did not erase the truth, and science, paired with persistence, finally brought Natalie's voice back to the surface. A single degraded DNA sample, once dismissed as unusable, became the key that reopened everything. That breakthrough, unlocked through advanced forensic genealogy, traced a line to a man who had escaped scrutiny for over a decade. Through determined investigation, courtroom testimony, and unwavering love from her family, the silence around Natalie's death was broken. Her killer was named. Justice was served. and her story now stands as a beacon. Natalie's legacy reaches far beyond Marquette. It lives in the laws being written to reform cold case funding. It breathes in the victims whose families now know they're not alone. And it flourishes in the foundation that bears her name, pushing forward the science and advocacy needed to prevent more names from being forgotten. In remembering Natalie, we are reminded that justice doesn't expire. Her life, once reduced to evidence bags and headlines, has been restored through purpose. Her memory is no longer frozen in the moment of her death, but alive in every act of progress that follows. Let her story be the reason we keep asking questions, the reason we keep looking for the lost, the reason we refuse to let darkness win. If Natalie's story moved you, share this video. Let her legacy echo in every case still waiting to be solved.